Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We've got another show for you that I think is going to hurt in some ways, but that's kind of the nature of the business right now in covering Penn State football. We're going to get to the recruiting situation for the Nittany Lions later here with Tyler Calvaruso, a resident recruiting insider. We haven't caught up with him in a couple weeks since I think about 48 to 72 hours after James Franklin was fired. Obviously, a lot of things have evolved with the 2026 recruiting class, not necessarily in a good way. Tyler Calvaruso is going to tell us what's going on with that class, what a new coaching hire is going to be facing immediately, and we'll get to some big picture conversation about what's next in trying to salvage things. But there are some special talents still on board with this 2026 class, so he'll give us kind of the lay of the land on where things stand with a few of those, including premier in-state lineman Kevin Brown. But to begin things, we're going to flip the script from what we did on Monday when Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen joined me fresh out of Terry Smith's press conference in Beaver Stadium. We did a lot of discussions on Penn State's current situation coming out of the bye week, both sides of the ball, storylines, players to watch. We'll regroup together for our third episode of this week, and that'll be our preview episode from a Penn State perspective. We'll get a look at practice between now and then. We'll have a chance to hear from Terry Smith again, from a few more players. We'll give you our final predictions for this game. But as I said, flipping the script right now to look at things from an Ohio State vantage point, and to do that, as we have every year for a long time on this podcast when this matchup rolls around, we bring in Patrick Murphy, who covers Ohio State within our 24/7 sports network for bucknuts.com. Patrick, always good to get you on board. I set the stage a little bit on Monday, and it's not a very pretty stage to set right now for Penn State fans, but you've got one team that held up their end of the bargain getting to this November 1st matchup. Ohio State is unbeaten, the number one ranked team in the country. You've got another team that has fallen so dramatically short along the way that they're now working with an interim head coach, and they're under 500 for the first time in 5 years. So what is your outlook for how this game has gone from must-see TV for the college football universe to a game that people are expecting Ohio State to win by 3 touchdowns?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Tyler. Always fun to do this with you. It's going to be sad the next, couple years when we don't at least have one of these scheduled on the regular season. Perhaps they meet in the postseason at some point. But to answer your question, it's been weird to watch from an outside perspective. I know you and I have talked a little bit here and there as this is going on. You guys have done a great job covering all that's gone on with this. But, just like everyone else, this was a game, whatever you want to call it, circle it, flag it, whatever, that you thought would be between two of the top, 5, 10, depending on how the schedule went, teams in the country. I think there was definitely a possibility that, say Ohio State loses to Texas to start the year, or Penn State loses the game against Oregon. And maybe they're not the 2 and 3 that they were in the preseason, but I think no one expected it to look like this. To me, it should have been a game that is a lot like the more recent ones where there was just a lot of hype around it. And it feels weird, honestly, that it's Penn State weekend. I mentioned to somebody over Ohio State's bye, looking forward at the schedule, and they're like, well, you got Penn State on there. And it was like, man, I forgot that Penn State, this just doesn't feel like Penn State week. So strange, I guess, is the way I would describe it. But, I certainly on the outside looking in, I can see why things have gone the way that they have in terms of the decisions made in State College. I'm interested to see what happens next. But yeah, not what I expected when this schedule first came out, anticipating this as one of the major games of this college football season.
Yeah, don't worry. We're going to let the coaching carousel conversation seep into this discussion a little bit later, because there's someone working in Columbus right now that may be of interest in this coaching search for Penn State. But I want to go back to yeah, who could that be? I'm going to go to Ryan Day's commentary from his Tuesday press conference, because I thought he went out of his way to pay a lot of respect to this Penn State squad. And although Ohio State has won 8 consecutive games in this series, you've seen it. There have been some very close calls, consistently contentious matchups, a couple one-point victories for Ohio State. It feels like it's always a one-possession game in the fourth quarter, but it's always gone the Buckeyes' way along the way. But Ryan Day was very clear that he said the message has been conveyed to his players and will continue to be conveyed, that they think that there's not many teams in America that have as much talent or more talent than Penn State. He talked about Penn State having a lot of the same players that they knew were going to be threats in the preseason. He mentioned that Drew Aller was no longer part of the equation. He didn't mention that Tony Rojas is out, and that's been a significant one for the defense. But what did you make of Ryan Day really kind of pouring it on Penn State, paying that kind of respect? And do you think internally that's a pretty important message for Ohio State, considering they have such far-ranging goals ahead of them? They're looking at a sub-500 team here on the first day of November, and you can forget that Penn State uniform, as typically meant, is going to be a long four-quarter battle.
Ryan Day's done a good job, I think, of communicating to his team through the media this year, or through public comments, I guess I should say. And that's not to take anything away from what he said against Penn State or about Penn State, but going into the Washington game, it was all about, hey, this is our first game on the road. This is a team with Damon Williams and these weapons that could cause us some issues. And Ohio State didn't have many issues. Illinois, obviously there was a lot to praise. They were a top 20 team. But even a couple weeks ago against Wisconsin, he's talking about Wisconsin's defense and how, they haven't been put in the best situations because of an offense that struggled. Like, this is a defense they really have to prepare for. I say that just to say, I think this was as genuine, and not to say that Ryan Day doesn't believe those things, but I think he is trying to send a message. To me, this was as realistic, as genuine as he's been about this, because I do think that not only does he feel like he needs to make sure his team is well aware that there is still talent on this Penn State roster and not to look at the record, but also I think he genuinely believes it. I think, in talking to Ryan Day before the season, like, it was clear he felt the Big Ten had some really good teams, and Penn State was obviously one of them. And yes, you take out Drew Aller, you take out a couple of the other guys, including James Franklin, from the mix of the teams that they've seen in the past and have started this year. There's still plenty of talent on this team. And for me, that's one of the biggest things going into this game is, how do the Buckeyes approach this? Do they come out and handle this like they have every other week this season and look at this like this is another important matchup? Or do they start to not necessarily look ahead, because the schedule doesn't get too difficult until you get to Michigan at the end of the regular season, but, just think that this win is already in the bag? I don't expect that because of the way Ryan Day has handled this and the rest of the coaches this season, but it's certainly, this is one of those games. They haven't had sort of that letdown performance yet this season. And if you're not careful, a Penn State team that doesn't have a ton to play for other than upsetting teams like Ohio State, this could certainly become one of those.
Ryan Day said something interesting, I thought. He says Penn State's going to bring a nothing to lose mentality. Yeah. So they have to be on high alert for the unexpected, especially coming out of a bye week. Both of these teams come out of a bye week. What was kind of the mission for the Buckeyes in terms of sharpening some things in their arsenal, maybe trying to improve some of their approach on either side of the ball? What are you curious to see as they come out from that week off and get ready for their stretch run?
The biggest thing for me is what they've done to change how they run the ball. If you're going to knock this team, and I don't even think this is nitpicking really, they have not run the ball well. And it's I think they're definitely outside the top 50. I don't remember exactly where they rank in yards per carry, but it's not good. It's not what people expected. And it's been sort of glossed over because you have a defense that can basically win you games. Julian Sayin, when they've allowed him to sort of be the guy, has shown he can step in and get these guys the ball in the passing game. So they haven't needed to run the ball to a massive extent. I think at some point they are going to need to. And the post-game press conference at Wisconsin 2 weeks ago, before that off week, Ryan Day, for the first time, really kind of admitted that they need to, work on running the ball, that there are some things they need to get fixed there. So I think that was certainly a priority. He also mentioned special teams, which, if you ask Buckeye fans, is an issue going back several years now. They had against Wisconsin, I think this is why it was on his mind, a fake punt that it was 4th and 19. The punter got 20 yards, which not to slight punters, but not what you want to see from the Buckeye special teams unit. So then it's just, the tendencies, right? We hear that all the time with teams going to the bye weeks. How do other teams view you? What are you doing to sort of change things up? The typical off week, bye week, whatever you want to call it stuff. But for me, that run game, I expect there to be some differences. I don't know if it's necessarily personnel. There was talk about maybe changing right guard Tegra Shabola, who started all of last season, has started all of this season, but has definitely been the sort of weak link of the offensive line. They've rotated in Josh Padilla, who's actually the backup center. It sounds like they're going to stick with Tegra Shabola, but they certainly need to figure out, and the offensive line has played well, I should say that, but in the run game specifically, a way to get that going so they don't have to be, a pass-heavy attack going forward.
And former Penn State assistant was here for a while with the tight ends. Tyler Bowen has been a key piece for them in terms of the offensive line, the rush attack. That is curious. This is the people want to see in your audience. I know that run game going, and this is the 16th ranked run defense, remarkably here at Penn State coming into the matchup. So could be a good equation for the Buckeyes. We'll see. Looking at the path for Ohio State to this point and through that bye week, they opened the season with a really dramatic win over Texas. Texas was the top-ranked team. A lot of people were chalking it up as Arch Manning's breakout kind of game against the defending national champions. Didn't work out that way. Ohio State won 14-7. Then it's 70-0 over Grambling, 37-9 over Ohio, 24-6 over Washington, 42-3 over Minnesota, 34-16 over Illinois, and most recently 34-0 over Wisconsin. As you've noted, there hasn't really been a moment where Ohio State, you check the score and you're like, oh my gosh, they're in trouble against a team they're not supposed to be in trouble against. What has gone right? Because this is a team that had to replace its offensive coordinator in Chip Kelly. They did that with an internal promotion for the guy we'll get to in a bit. And they had to replace their defensive coordinator, who, as you know, will be back in Columbus this Saturday wearing a Penn State logo on his shirt. So are you surprised that it's been that seamless thus far through 7 games, considering some of that turnover?
I am. And I think the biggest thing for me, anytime I've seen a team come off a championship, be it professional, college, high school teams even, is how do you take that and build on it or build back up that next year? Because you work so hard to climb up the mountain, and it's just natural human nature to mentally sort of take some things off, maybe take some shortcuts because you've been there, you've done that. I've seen it before. I'm sure, people listening can think of examples. Ohio State hasn't done that. Now, I think some of that has to do with the fact that so many guys did leave, and, Ohio State, you're fortunate enough to have guys that, they say you don't rebuild, you reload. They had plenty of guys step into bigger roles that are equally, if not more talented than the players they replace. So that certainly helps. But so many new guys feeling like, hey, we weren't really a big part of that national championship team last year. Yeah, we were on it, and you're not taking that away from them, but they want to win a national championship where they are contributors or starters or whatever it may be. And so I think they had the right mentality this offseason of they're not cutting corners. They're not doing anything, feeling good about themselves because they don't feel like they accomplished that. And I think the coaching staff has done a really good job. You talk about each week having that same workman-like sort of mentality of, they've said this, we've heard a few coaches say this, you have to kind of enjoy the process during the week to get the results you want on Saturday. And that becomes mundane throughout the course of the season, right? Especially games where you're big favorites a lot of the times. Like, do I really need to, hit the cold tub or the, this or that, the recovery that I would normally do? Do I need to run that extra little bit? All of those things, I think they have handled really well in order to come out on Saturdays and then go out and execute the way they want. And frankly, if you ask Ohio State fans, I think they'd say it's kind of become a little bit boring. Like, their offense isn't putting up 70 points a game. They're not playing fast. They're doing this all intentionally. So, you read out those wins. They're winning comfortably, but it's not huge blowouts. There also hasn't been anything to be too concerned about. So it's just a little mundane, which I think Ryan Day is perfectly happy with.
Mundane sounds pretty nice compared to the dumpster fire that we've been dealing with here in Happy Valley, Patrick. When you talk about QB1 for Ohio State, there's been a lot of changes over the years. They've had one and done starters for one reason or another, and pretty much throughout this span, whether it was Urban Meyer or now Ryan Day, been high level performances, and Julian Sayin matches up with that. A former 5-star recruit, briefly looked like he was going to be in an Alabama uniform, and then there's a coaching change down there. He ends up in Columbus, waits his turn for a bit, and this year stepping up, 80% pass completion, about 1,800 yards on the season so far, 19 touchdown throws to only 3 interceptions. I believe he's gone 300 plus passing yards in like 4 of the last 6 games or something like that. So what is gone right for Sayin? And stating the obvious, he has one of the premier receivers we've ever seen at the college level, I think, and Jeremiah Smith. But what is working with Sayin? What do we need to know about Jeremiah Smith in year 2? And who are the other pieces of this offensive attack who really get things going?
Starting with Sayin, it's been sort of exactly what people told us a Julian Sayin-led offense would be. I did a story during the first bye week about Julian and talking to his high school coach, talking to some of our guys who covered him in recruiting, talking to his quarterbacks coach. And the main thing that came out of that was just like, he's got talent, no doubt about it, but just the poise that he shows. And I think that was evident from week 1 against Texas. Ohio State didn't have him do too much. I think he threw 20 passes, but the moment wasn't too big for him. And you flip it over to the other side in Arch Manning, and obviously his season hasn't gone as anyone expected it, but that moment did seem a little big for Arch, and as a first-time real starter. I know he started a couple games last year, and so that stood out. And just each week, he's sort of that California cool. He's a San Diego guy, and it's just, nothing seems to phase him, good, bad, otherwise. He just kind of stays his level, goes about his business. And, obviously he's talented. He was a 5-star prospect, makes good decisions, has a good arm, all those things. But for me, it's just like that moment has never seemed to be too big. Obviously there are bigger games to come. So we'll see about that. Now, it doesn't hurt. You mentioned Jeremiah Smith to have the weapons around him that he does. Carnell Tate, who started last year, but really only had a few good games as kind of the third fiddle behind Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka, has really come into his own. I think Buckeye fans or anyone who followed Carnell in recruiting is not surprised by this. It's just kind of, he had to wait his turn to see the targets that, allow him to put up numbers. It's, if you ask me, I think it's hard to find a receiving duo in the country that's as good as these two. I'm sure there are some examples that you could make out there.
Don't you say that every year you come on the show about whoever's leading this damn receiver group?
that might be true. And look, I think, and we'll get to why here in a few minutes, but they've done a really good job with that. And you combine getting these receivers in, these highly regarded receivers, and developing them. And I think that's the thing that often gets lost in the conversation is, oh yeah, well, when you just get 5-star guys in, like, you're going to be good at receiver. Well, there's a lot of 5-star receivers out there that don't work out. Not many of them have come through Ohio State. So I think the way that Brian Hartline, we'll just put his name out there now, has worked with these guys, and, not only the way that they've developed, but the way that they're willing to wait. Carnell Tate last offseason, there were multiple programs that were very interested in him and were willing to pay him NIL money to get him to transfer from Ohio State. How serious those conversations ever got, I can't say, but I do know that he wanted to stay and be a Buckeye and continue to be developed by Brian Hartline. So it certainly helps. I will give credit. You mentioned Tyler Bowen earlier. Sayin has rarely been pressured. The most was against Wisconsin 2 weeks ago, and that was kind of a game. If there was a game that the Buckeyes sort of sleptwalk through a little bit, it was that. That was easily the worst the offensive line has played. And I think Sayin was still only sacked once. So that certainly helps too. Clean pocket for a young quarterback, and a guy who can move around, but isn't really a dual threat guy. So he's been able to throw where and when he wants. That helps. So I think the offense has set him up for success, but he too has put himself in a good position, sort of with the way he handles himself and the way he goes about his business.
3 sacks surrendered for Ohio State through 7 matchups. You look at Jeremiah Smith, I believe I had this math correct, 22 touchdown catches in 23 career games.
Yeah,
just
that sounds right.
Remarkable. And Carnell Tate averaging about 17.5 yards per catch on 34 receptions this season, 6 touchdowns in his own right. And a couple running backs to note here. Bo Jackson, yes, an awesome name for a running back, of course. He's a guy who was on Penn State's recruiting radar for a long time. He's the leading rusher for Buckeyes, 433 yards with about 6.5-yard average. And then C.J. Donaldson, who's the guy that we saw play against Penn State when he was with West Virginia a couple of different times. He's been kind of that secondary running back as part of the plan. 6 touchdowns on the ground for Donaldson to this point.
Tyler, let me add real quick just in the running game. They've really tried to figure out the best way to guys who can break tackles. Last week against Wisconsin, Isaiah West, another true freshman, got his biggest run. We're talking about stuff that they were working on during the bye week. I wonder if you see more Isaiah West. He led the Buckeyes in rushing yards against Wisconsin. I think he had 55 or so. that's a guy to keep in mind. He may be in there. And do you know Bo Jackson's real name?
What is it?
Lamar. So he's either Bo Jackson or he's Lamar Jackson.
Either way, he's got a lot to live up to if he wants to become the most well-known football player with that name.
Yeah.
When we look at the defense, I mean, across the board statistically so far, and again, there's tests that await, there's been improvements from what they did last year when they were the top-ranked defense in America, and using that to get through the playoffs into a national championship. First off, let's talk about Jim Knowles, because he is obviously the big prize of the offseason for Penn State. Not only do you add this coordinator who's got a proven track record, but you take him away from the team that's been your biggest hurdle within your own conference. For whatever reason, and you told us a long time ago, it can take some time for his defense to click. It has not clicked so far. Terry Smith called it very complicated last week. We spent a lot of time on the show on Monday discussing some of the letdowns about this defense, whether it's a lack of linebacker depth being developed or giving up late leads or getting boat raced by UCLA a month ago. But ultimately, it just has not come to fruition how they anticipated. What did Ryan Day have to say about Jim Knowles, that and kind of I guess a parting of ways that look pretty ugly from the outside looking in, and the timing of it? And do you think there is any kernel of an extra motivation within the facility for the Buckeyes to maybe stick it to Jim Knowles on Saturday afternoon?
So to start with your question about Ryan Day, I think he took very much, mostly the high road. He didn't say anything that was going to grab too many headlines. He did say that there hasn't been much communication between him and Jim Knowles, which, look, I think maybe that sounds bad, but also I think that there probably hasn't been a ton of communication between Ryan Day and Chip Kelly since he left, because they're both doing other jobs, and those two talk a lot, right? So the way I kind of read it is that there was no love lost here. Like, clearly there was a reason Jim Knowles had started to seek out other opportunities, and Ohio State knew that he had done good things. They don't want to besmirch his name by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it just, for whatever reason, whether it be personalities or whatnot, it didn't work out on that side. It did work out on the football field, which obviously makes it a lot easier to look back on with a fonder lens than you might have if, say, the Buckeyes had troubles defensively all 3 years Jim Knowles was there. So I think there are certainly people in the building, to get to your second question, that are eager to go out against Jim Knowles, but that would be true against anyone and sort of prove themselves. We had a few weeks ago, Peyton Pierce, one of the sort of the third linebacker, mentioned that he's gotten to know Matt Patricia a lot better in the first few weeks that he was here than he did Jim Knowles. Like, I think they're just, and you guys have gotten to know him a little bit, like, it's just not a huge personality guy. And I think now that they have a defensive coordinator that has a bit more of that, there's been sort of some comparisons. But no, I don't think this is like some sort of situation where they are, Jim Knowles' picture, I don't think is hanging inside the locker room, right? Like, let's go beat that guy. Like, it didn't end on that sour of a note. At least that's my read of it. In the sense that they need to, prove something against Jim Knowles' defense. I think, maybe if anything, it's sort of the other way around, where Jim Knowles wants to prove against this Ohio State offense. Now, easy to say given the situation in State College, but I think both sides kind of got what they wanted out of it. And, everybody gets a national championship ring, and then you move on and do your own thing.
Yeah, Ryan Day said he expects some curveballs from Jim Knowles coming off the bye week, coming out to Columbus. I'm curious what kind of pitches Matt Patricia has been throwing over the course of the 7 games, because, as I said, starting with that Texas game, they've been clamped down largely on the opposing offense. The statistics reflect that. The scoreboard reflects that. You showed, I think, some very healthy, I don't want to call concern, but you were kind of like, let's wait and see with Matt Patricia, because wasn't always pretty when he was coaching it up at the NFL level. It's a transition when you're dealing with college kids and what that might mean day to day. Why has it been such a successful fit? Because it's hard to argue it hasn't been. And remind our audience who the players that really make things go on defense.
I think the reason it's worked so well is a fewfold. The first one I would say is because of what Jim Knowles established, the foundation he laid, and because it was a defense that required high football IQ and things like that, they were ready to take on what Matt Patricia brought, which was kind of a pro-style defense, for lack of a better term. I think one of the things that we've learned that Matt Patricia is really good at, and maybe this should have been something that I saw earlier, is because in the NFL, you basically have to redo defenses if you're coaching for as long as he was in New England. You have to be able to work with the personnel you're given to some degree. And I think he came in and he's talked about this. He spent a lot of spring practice just observing and seeing what he had on that side of the ball and what would work the best. Now, obviously, there were certain guys that he knew, the Caleb Downs, the Sonny Styles of the world that he was familiar with. But it was, okay, what other pieces do I have here? And how do I play with them to make not only them successful, but us successful overall? And then the third thing I'd say is, other than Jim Knowles, Ohio State's defensive staff remained intact. And Ryan Day really stressed that it had to be somebody who could fit in with that group. And not just, as coaches, but I think they did want some more camaraderie because much of that staff is outgoing. I think that there's a good vibe coming out of that side of the ball. And I think Matt Patricia, and this is where I would say I'm probably most surprised, has really embodied that and really fit in with the culture of that defensive side of the ball. He appears to get along really well with the guys. He's worked with Tim Walton, the cornerbacks coach and secondaries coach, before in the NFL. He actually worked out James Laurinaitis when James Laurinaitis was coming out of Ohio State at the pro day. So he has relationships with some of these guys. He's developed relationships with them. And I think that's probably a pretty underrated thing when you're going to work with these guys every day. I mentioned a couple names already, but the returners were Sonny Styles, Caleb Downs, Davis Igbinosun, guys that have emerged. I think Caden Curry is probably one of the biggest names on the defensive line. His numbers are not dissimilar from Chase Young's first year as a starter. Not the year Chase Young was a Heisman finalist, but the year before. Just don't want to get too crazy there. But Caden Curry's been really good. Arvell Reese playing alongside Sonny Styles at linebacker. He's a guy who I don't think was on many draft boards and now could be, some are saying, projecting him as a first-round pick. Just a versatile guy, great athlete, but has really learned how to play the linebacker position. And then Jermaine Matthews at corner opposite Davis Igbinosun. He was a guy who rotated in last year, played against Penn State, so people may remember him. But he's been just waiting his opportunity to play. He was a kid that coming out of Cincinnati, they were really excited about. It was just a matter of getting him sort of up the depth chart and working him in. And he's played at the nickel spot. He's played outside corner. He's done really well at both positions. So they've done a good job of figuring out where guys fit best and using them in the way that helps everybody involved.
I know all the people who have already checked out on this season or have one foot off the bandwagon this season in terms of watching this particular Penn State team have been waiting. When are you going to bring up Brian Hartline? What do we need to know? So Brian Hartline was added to our hot board at lions247.com, which, by the way, if you're not engaged there, if you're not a VIP subscriber, you're missing out. 50% off right now for VIP access. There's more than 23,000 comments on this thing. We just hit 2 million views on our board/thread combined. So great spot to be if you're trying to keep your finger on the pulse here. But Patrick, Brian Hartline's a guy that obviously has had a ton of success going back to, I think, 2017 with the Buckeyes. He became receivers coach in 2018. You can go down a long list of guys who've Biletnikoff Award winner, first round NFL draft pick, Big Ten receiver of the year. It's just as impressive of a position room as we've seen over the course of his tenure there, I think, across college football. He is now the offensive coordinator after Chip Kelly leaves. I know he's been involved with the OC title in the past, but this feels like a full-fledged deal here in 2025. So what do you make of some of the buzz that we've been discussing? I know we've texted back and forth a bit in terms of Brian Hartline being on Penn State's radar, perhaps reciprocating that interest with Penn State. I'm of the belief that we've got a full month ahead of us before we even get any kind of finality to this coaching search, and it may even go beyond that. But Thanksgiving weekend's really what I'm looking at. So we've got a ways to go. What would you kind of pass along to me, to our audience, about what you've learned about Brian Hartline during your time covering this program, and maybe his influence in the success at Ohio State under Ryan Day and previously with Urban Meyer, and then rolling it a little bit forward, being the CEO of his own program?
It's interesting, Brian Hartline's sort of career trajectory into coaching, because the way he sort of tells it, like he was back in Columbus, He was around the program after he retired from the NFL. He spent the 1 year with the Cleveland Browns. So he was close. He's back in Columbus living here with his wife. And Zach Smith, the receivers coach at the time, sort of took him under his wing a little bit, convinced him to be a GA. It wasn't something that Brian Hartline was actively seeking out. And he's just slowly gotten more and more and more into it. It started, if your listeners remember the Zach Smith saga that happened in 2018 and, him getting let go, they needed somebody to step into the receivers coach. Brian Hartline took it as an interim and I think really grew a lot that year and gets the job full time. You mentioned the success that he's had coaching that position, but then the question's been, well, what does he want to do next? And when Brian Hartline's been asked about that, he's sort of been coy, I guess, or maybe he doesn't even know exactly. Like, this wasn't a part of his plan post-football necessarily. So, it's not like he set out one day to be, I want to be a coach. And so I think he's just kind of slowly worked his way up and gotten better. What I've been really impressed at from the he's still the wide receivers coach, but becoming this offensive coordinator and sort of the 3 years, including this one, transition that he's had, the way now that he can talk about offensive football is different than when he was talking about it just from a wide receiver's perspective. He's clearly put in time to learn about the run game and the offensive line and all the other aspects that it takes to make an offense go, the quarterback play. Like, you asked Brian Hartline 4 or 5 years ago about quarterbacks. As long as they're getting him the ball to receivers, I think he's pretty happy, right? But now he can talk more detailed about Julian Sayin, for instance. I think even the defensive side of the ball, he knows more than he probably did before, just because he's had to do that if he wants to progress. Brian Hartline as a head coach is interesting because, as you said, it's basically been 7 games of him as a play caller, and I do think he's been around a lot of good people. I think he's been influenced by all of them in one way or another. Is he ready to go be a head coach? That's where I don't know. And because there's so much more to it these days, right? You have to, as you put it, be the CEO. You have to bring people along with you. Who would he bring with him, from Ohio State or other places that he knows? I don't know how big of a tree of connections he has within the coaching community. And then you talk about doing it at a place like Penn State, where the demands are just as high as they are at Ohio State for the first time. It worked out with a guy like Ryan Day becoming a first-time head coach at Ohio State, but it took several years, right, before they finally got where they wanted to. And I'm not sure Penn State is at a place where they want to give Brian Hartline necessarily that time to develop as a head coach, which is why I've thought it's been not surprising. He's certainly a guy that should be on people's radars, but maybe how big of a buzz this conversation has generated, just because if I were guessing his next step, it would be a Mac school as a head coach, or maybe a Cincinnati or something like that, he doesn't have that type of pressure. He can make some mistakes and it doesn't cost as much. But if Penn State's interested and Brian Hartline's interested, I certainly don't think you certainly take the call and see what happens. Right. And from there, I guess you see how it goes. But I think someday if he wants to do it, I think he's proven that he can take on any of these coaching responsibilities that have been put on him. So it won't surprise me if he's a successful coach down the road. I think the one other thing that might be in the back of Brian Hartline's mind, and this came up when we were done with the press conference the other day, what does he want his reputation and relationship at Ohio State to be going forward? Because if you take a job at Penn State, you're probably not coming back to coach at Ohio State, or at least that becomes a more difficult path back if that is an ultimate goal someday. I don't know if that's on Brian Hartline's radar, thought process, anything like that, but somebody brought that up and I thought it was an interesting point.
I can tell you there are already fears on our board that if he were to become Penn State's next head coach and Ryan Day were to move on, that he would jump at a chance to go back. Of course, Marcus Freeman has to be considered a part of that potential conversation. And oh, by the way, Ryan Day hasn't indicated he's going anywhere anytime soon. Before I ask you your prediction on this game, I just want to ask you, if you can, the dynamics of his presence, of his influence on the players, on the locker room, in that receiver room. I remember speaking with Julian Fleming, 18 months ago or whatever, when he had made his move to Penn State, about what it was like to be in that receiver room led by Brian Hartline. But when you put away all the other things and putting together a staff and having to figure out how to allocate NIL and build a roster, just about a guy walking the hallways, about a guy walking and staying in front of a team meeting room. What's your impression of Hartline there?
Yeah, I think that all of that he can do really well. I think the best thing, not the best thing, one of the best things about Brian Hartline is the way that he develops relationships with these guys and people on staff. I'll include them too. Like, he relates really well to high school kids and connecting with them as he does his peers within the building. And I think that's impressive. I don't think everybody can do that, as easy as it may sound. So I think that from a relationship and getting to know players, working with players, like, I think he would hit that out of the park. I think he has done that at Ohio State, and that's been part of the success. I think he is a leader. I think even as a player, he was a guy who had no issues kind of getting in front of the team or speaking up when needed to. So I think, he can do all of those things. He's not the biggest fan of sitting in front of the media. We used to get coordinators, one coordinator each week. We do not get that this year. I'm not saying that's Brian Hartline. That could be Matt Patricia, but he's not the biggest fan of that. But I do think that he communicates well, both to the media and to his players, to his staff. I think he's very organized too. And he's talked about that this year of becoming an offensive coordinator, like the need to be even more organized than he was before. And that only ramps up if you become a head coach. So I think sort of the ducks are in a row if and when he wants to do it. Because I definitely, like I said, I think, the way he handles himself, the way he's sort of developed his football mind, all of that, it makes sense. It's just a matter of, is this the right time, 7 games into being a play caller?
Appreciate your perspective there. Let's get your perspective on one more thing. How do you think this one plays out Saturday afternoon in Columbus? Penn State considered a 20.5-point underdog.
I think this game is probably going to be closer than people expect. Like, for me, if I'm on the Penn State side of things in the locker room, a player on the team, whatever, like, as I said earlier, this is your chance to go prove something. And I've said this on a few shows I've done this week. I think back to 2011 when Ohio State had a really disappointing season after Jim Tressel left, before Urban Meyer arrives under Luke Fickell. They go 6-7. You talk to Buckeye fans about that year, the one thing that everyone remembers is they upset Wisconsin at Ohio Stadium on a Hail Mary. And, people can tell you where they were, their memories, all that. And I think this is an opportunity for Penn State to do something similar. And I think that's the way they're going to view it, like we were talking about with Ryan Day earlier and kind of how he framed it. Now, pulling that upset is more difficult, right? And I think ultimately, until this Buckeye team shows me that they aren't taking every opponent the same way and treating it the same, like we were talking about before, like, I have to stick with what's worked there. But I think it will be probably closer. You and I were talking before the show. It could be uncomfortable at halftime if Penn State comes out with their hair on fire and maybe Ohio State doesn't. I do think Ohio State ends up pulling away. This is an unofficial score prediction, but no, I'm just kidding. But on my initial thing, it wouldn't surprise me if it's like a 24-10, 27-13. We'll go 24-10 type of score. Ohio State hasn't put a ton of points on everybody, almost intentionally so. I think this defense is good enough to hold Penn State, especially with the young quarterback. But again, I think they might have some things, especially coming off the bye, that Ohio State hasn't seen, that allows Penn State to keep this tighter than Buckeye fans would like for a while. And then adjustments and things like that end up pulling away for the Buckeyes.
Patrick, we always appreciate when you get on with us. I know I'll be returning the favor on your podcast later this week, and we'll talk about where Penn State is coming into the matchup. But always good stuff, and enjoy the game on Saturday, and good luck with the rest of your coverage this season.
Awesome. Thanks. You too, Tyler.
Great stuff from Patrick Murphy, as always, over at Bucknuts, our Ohio State home within the 24/7 Sports Network. As promised, we're going to get into some recruiting conversation right now for the first time in a couple weeks with Tyler Calvaruso, Lions 24/7 recruiting insider. Tyler, welcome back in. I know you were standing by patiently as we were discussing some things with Patrick Murphy. A lot to talk about there between the matchup and the Brian Hartline interest, but I want to get into a lot with you right now, buddy, because we have some catching up to do. It's been a couple weeks, as I said. At that point, things were starting to unravel for the class. To this point, things have continued to unravel. So why don't you bring us up to speed on where the 2026 class is? And we probably should start with the departures who've been impacted the entire process.
Yep, the hits keep coming, man. It's not surprising. It's not surprising to anyone inside of Lash. This is just the name of the game. It's the nature of a midseason coaching change. Penn State staff, I think, has done about all it can to weather this storm to the peak of its ability. But when there's so much uncertainty surrounding a program and so much uncertainty surrounding a coaching staff, you're handcuffed definitely to a degree. And I think you're seeing that with some of the recent decisions that have come down the pipeline from either kids who were committed to Penn State at one point decided to completely back off, or the group that decided, hey, I'm going to stay committed to Penn State while exploring my additional options. Some of those guys have ultimately decided to go elsewhere. We will start with the kids who have outright flipped. We'll start with Alex Haskell, defensive lineman out of Philly. We heralded him as a really big coup on the defensive line throughout the cycle. He flipped to Syracuse last week. That was a recruitment where the Orange were an original finalist. They did not get the nod from Haskell when he committed to Penn State in May, but Fran Brown and his staff are getting Haskell on the rebound. So difficult loss in the trenches for Dion Barnes. Another really tough loss for Penn State. I think me and you could probably sit here and argue one of the tougher outcomes since the firing of James Franklin. Jasir Rogers, really talented wide receiver out of Delaware. He flipped from Penn State to Oklahoma on Monday following a weekend official visit with the Sooners. Just a really tough deal because Rogers has the skill set and projects as the kind of player who can come in and really give you kind of the explosiveness that Penn State is seeking at the wide receiver position moving forward. The SEC came calling, which I don't think shocked anyone, giving Rogers talent and upside that we saw throughout the summer and on his senior season film. He's heading down to Norman to play at Oklahoma. Maybe, depending on where Penn State takes its head coaching search, the Nittany Lions could work their way back in the equation, but Rogers really likes Oklahoma, so difficult deal for the Nittany Lions there. Secondary, Julian Peterson, decommitted, talented cornerback out of South Jersey. Another really big blow on the back end of the secondary was Darryl Carey, really talented safety out of DeMatha Catholic in Maryland. He decommitted, instantly picked up a crystal ball prediction to land at Maryland. Wisconsin offered last night. So another really high-level prospect who is in this class deciding to completely back off that commitment, completely reopen things, not even stay committed to Penn State at this point. And then a guy like Kevin Brown, top 100 offensive tackle prospect, one of the top recruits in the country. He has been one of the pillars of this Penn State recruiting class. He's still committed. He is still willing to be patient, as many others are, while Penn State searches for a new head coach, but he has been exploring additional options. Kicked off an official visit to West Virginia on Tuesday. He is seriously considering a weekend official visit to Ohio State. Nothing is finalized in that regard yet, but it is in the works and it is being worked out. With this being Brown's bye week, Harrisburg earned a first-round bye in the 6A District 3 playoffs. It's opening the door for him to make visits this weekend. It's opening the door for Messiah Mickens, four-star running back commit, to make visits this weekend. Nothing, as far as I'm aware of. Both of them have been great throughout this process. Nothing is finalized for this weekend yet, but just two of many recruits exploring additional options. So that's where we're at right now. There's been a ton of movement, ton of visits elsewhere. It's going to continue. I think you don't really want to assume anything in recruiting, but it's safe to assume there's going to be more movement against Penn State at some point because that's just the way things are trending in certain recruitments. And Terry Smith and his staff, they're going to stay at it. But again, there's really only so much they can do.
15 commits on board right now on our 24/7 sports page. Of course, this feels like it's a minute-by-minute process, so it may change by the time you take a look online.
Yeah.
But I think it was at right around 25 to 27 before James Franklin was fired in terms of the commitment number. And just getting back to one of those, and I know you mentioned a lot of guys who left the class, but Jasir Rogers, to me, all due respect to our ranking system, he was in the middle of the pack probably in this class in terms of that. I thought he was one of the premier members of this recruiting class based on what we witnessed across prospect camps here in Happy Valley, him working for the staff a few different times. To me, he looked as good as any wide receiver prospect that in terms of that they've brought in the last 4, 5, 6 years, and the kind of guy that could maybe show up and do some things for you right away. So for him to be an Oklahoma commit is a really tough pill to swallow because I felt like they were ahead of the curve on this kid. And they are with a lot of these players. And let's note this, 15 of those with 15 commits, Many of them have either said their recruitments are reopened, they're exploring their options, or they're already visiting places. You talked about Kevin Brown. I think he has long been the most important piece of the puzzle here. He's been such a loyal soldier for this class as well, but down in Morgantown, his father's alma mater. I know they rolled out the red carpet for him down there. I think one of our West Virginia reporters in the 24/7 Sports Network mentioned that Rodriguez was late for his press conference, and that was probably because he was hosting and prioritizing Kevin Brown. And not to rub salt in the wound here, but it is Ohio State week, and you've mentioned this on the board, I think, a couple of times. Is Ohio State in play here for Kevin Brown, and are they potentially in play to host him this weekend if he were to get out and make a visit?
Yeah, I definitely think Ohio State is in play here. To what degree, I think that's something we'll determine if and when a visit occurs. I got to give credit to actually one of our subscribers who made this comparison yesterday on the board when discussing Kevin Brown. So I can't take any sort of credit for this. Brown's recruitment is kind of shaping up in a manner where it reminds you a little bit of Bryce Baker last cycle. And for those who might not remember who Bryce Baker is, he was an elite quarterback prospect out of North Carolina, was committed to North Carolina, stayed committed to North Carolina at the time of the coaching change when the Tar Heels moved on from Mack Brown. But he took an official visit to Penn State because he was setting up a backup plan, essentially, in the event that he wasn't a fan of the direction North Carolina took things. Obviously, they bring in Bill Belichick. Baker signs with UNC. That's all done. Brown gives me a similar feeling in a sense that I think he really wants to be at Penn State, and he's very willing to be patient and see how things go in this search, but they've got to hit on the hire, and he's doing what I've said since the start of this. He's taking the right approach, in my opinion. He's giving himself plan B, plan C if needed, because you just don't know where things are going to go. There's no certainty on the way this coaching search is going to play out. And I think the reason why it's not an apples to orange or apples to apples comparison is because Kevin Brown and his father, Tim, who you mentioned, has the offensive line background, played at a high level at West Virginia. They've built an airtight relationship with Phil Trautwein throughout the cycle. They're very bought into Phil Trautwein's developmental ability. Who knows if he's going to be part of the next Penn State staff. So I think he is a variable in this recruitment that Penn State fans need to follow really closely. That's not to say Kevin Brown is just 100% going to follow Phil Trautwein wherever he lands next, but he's a variable and a very important one in this equation. But to your Ohio State point, yeah, I think we're at a point in the cycle where any school that gets a visit from a Penn State commit needs to be charted as a serious threat. And Ohio State, I think it goes without saying the level that program operates. So we've seen certain recruits, kids who have been committed to Penn State for a while, they're taking visits elsewhere. Some of the programs are kind of, not to disrespect any other programs out there, but they're kind of middling right now, right? Ohio State does not operate in that realm. They are one of the elite of elites of college football right now. So anytime one of Penn State's commits gets out to a program like that and makes a visit this late in the game, given the circumstances, it's definitely noteworthy. Like Elijah Littlejohn's another one too. Visiting Georgia, visiting Vandy. Anytime those level of I can't believe I'm saying Vandy in that sentence, but
Top 10
given,
Vandy.
Given the state of that program, they right now they're in that mix as well. So anytime you're seeing visits to those kinds of programs lined up down the stretch, it's definitely creates a level of concern. And Brown, now that he might, his wording to me was more than likely this weekend for Ohio State. Again, as far as I know, still nothing finalized with the Buckeyes. I'm going to catch up with Brown once he returns home from Morgantown. We're not going to be bothering him on his official visit, but we'll see where things go. But the more than likely was the description, and there's definitely concern that comes with that if you're a Penn State fan.
And Brown's a young man that, he was offered by Phil Trautwein and this staff during his freshman season, back when he was about 225 pounds or so. And you project him forward, and you keep projecting, and he's building up his body. And to say that Phil Trautwein is extremely high on him and what he can be for Penn State is an understatement. I know you and I have both had some chats on the field with Phil during prospect camps. I think he thinks as highly of this guy as he has of any offensive lineman he's had a chance to bring into the program during his 5-6 years here in Happy Valley. And to Kevin Brown's credit, until things went awry for James Franklin and coaching change was made, him and his family were essentially in a submarine when it came to recruiting.
Yeah.
Once they locked in with this commitment, they just went in the submarine and they tuned everybody else out. And now he's trying to play catch up in terms of sorting through potential options here. But yeah, I think he is, him, Matt Sieg here in the state, defensive back who's a do everything player in Western Pennsylvania, a couple of the headliners to keep track of. And Tyler Cabruso will continue to do that at Lions247.com. Tyler, I know a lot of people, when you post things on our board right now and you post your articles, people essentially want to flip you off and say, get out of here with this information. I don't want to read it right now. But let's kind of fast forward a little bit, because eventually Penn State will not be as rudderless as they may appear right now. They will have a full-time head coach in place. They will have a staff being assembled. There will be answers about which of the current staff members are going to be retained and which are going to be searching for other jobs on different campuses. So how salvageable is this recruiting class in 2026 if they make a hire on the timeline of, let's say, by that first week of December, around that Thanksgiving weekend as the regular season comes to a close? For the sake of this conversation, let's say that's the timeline, rather than them waiting and hoping that a playoff participant is going to be, good to their word and come join them after a playoff run. I think that's a high risk, and I don't know if you get rewarded at the end of that process. So let's say next 4 or 5 weeks they have a solution. How salvageable is the situation, and what will need to be done to provide some solutions?
It's salvageable, but it's not going to be easy. And there are a couple different reasons for that. The first of which is, these kids are feeling a pretty high level of pressure right now with the beginning of the early signing period coming up. So while many of them would love to play this thing out to the fullest and see where Penn State ultimately takes things and who it hires, the fact of the matter is, a lot of these guys, they would like to enroll early at their school of choice. And even if Penn State goes on that Thanksgiving timeline, there's only so much time between then and the beginning of the early signing period. You've got, let's say that Thanksgiving week, just hypothetically, you've only got really a week to get to know the new Penn State head coach and who he might be bringing on his staff before the beginning of that early signing period. Another factor that is working against Penn State that previously wasn't working against Penn State is a change to the recruiting calendar. There was a little bit in December where I believe it was a 2-week stretch from the 8th to, I want to say, the 21st or the 22nd. I got to go back and double check. But it was looking like a quiet period. And the staff would have been able to get some of the commits back to campus for visits. Now, new rule changes, legislation, however you want to phrase it, it's looking more like a dead period. I've got to do some more digging into that. I'm not quite sure of the exact specifics, what has or hasn't been passed on the recruiting calendar quite yet, but it has been mentioned to me as something that could work against Penn State down the stretch as it tries to keep this class intact and, like you said, salvage what's left. And I wrote it earlier in the week. This staff's really been in salvage mode since the day James Franklin got fired. And I think everyone's really there. I give the staff credit for being as transparent as it has been with the commits throughout the process. I think that's why you're seeing a lot of kids who have decided to stay committed and give the program a chance to get a new guy in here before making a decision. But like I said, even with that hypothetical timeline, it's not going to be easy just because of the time crunch. And that's one of those things that nobody can really do anything about it. These kids, they want clarity, they want certainty, they want to know where they're playing college football next year. And as a short timeline like that, it creates a lot of difficulty for Penn State. But I do think that in the end, there will be some guys who stick. I'm not sure what that number will look like. I think it's extremely premature to even predict that kind of a number. I think some of these kids will really, really like who Penn State ultimately lands, because that's the name of the game. Sometimes you bring in a new head coach and personalities click right off the bat upon first, second meeting, first, second phone call. Also, and I mentioned it earlier, and this isn't really, it's not a slight at some of these other programs. Some of these other options, do they really stack up to Penn State? Despite the coaching change, do some of these programs really have the same juice Penn State has? That's why I think some kids will stick, because quite frankly, some of these options elsewhere that have been explored, they're not at the same level.
Let's talk about that next head coach who's going to be tasked with putting things together. And by the way, maybe this is a cycle where we actually pay a little bit more attention to that February signing day, the classic one that we just have kind of forgotten about over the years because not much happens there. Could be pretty important right now for Penn State if you look at it that way. But when you talk about I know you've been following our hot board of coaching candidates over at lions247.com. I know you heard me and Patrick talking about a candidate before you came on. Who in your mind is maybe on that list? Who is the guy that you think could maybe hit the ground running quickest as a recruiter, attract some interest, maybe bring some commits with him potentially, whether it's one of those head coaches or an offensive coordinator? Who do you think maybe stands out among that in that regard?
I think Brian Hartline has some juice. I know you guys just spent a ton of time talking about him, and I'd agree with the sentiment that he would bring something right away on the recruiting trail for Penn State. Young, hungry, reputation as an assistant. It's among the best in college football. I think he is at a point in his coaching career where he's been around long enough. He knows exactly how the recruiting game works. He knows exactly how NIL works. Obviously, he has not been at the forefront of it as a head coach. That's a layer that you kind of need to weigh when evaluating his potential prowess as a recruiter at a place like Penn State, being the man in charge. But I think he seems like a very charismatic guy. You talk to prospects who have been involved with Brian Hartline throughout the recruiting process. Charismatic guy, relatable guy, obviously has that NFL background, so he knows what it takes to get to the next level. I think he's a name that would generate a lot of excitement from a recruiting perspective. I think Eli Drinkwitz, to an extent, would also generate that kind of excitement, and here's why. You go look back at some of his early recruiting classes at Missouri. I mean, Missouri's not an easy place to recruit, but he built up steadily, and then he's bringing in five-star guys like Luther Burden, who's now in the NFL with the Chicago Bears as a standout wide receiver. So he, as his tenure at Missouri has progressed, he has been able to garner more and more buyout from the most important people in the room when it comes to donations, NIL, all that kind of stuff. That's why you've been able to see.
You said buyout. That's the wrong word these days.
Yeah,
buy-in.
Buy-in. Yeah, we're talking about so much about buyouts these days. Jeez, yeah, no, thank you for that. He has accumulated so much buy-in from the most important people at Missouri. It could give you reason to have optimism that he can accomplish a similar feat in State College. There are obviously hoops to jump through in that regard because you're walking into a different kind of situation in a different kind of place, but there is a history of accomplishing that feat. And recruits who have been involved with Drinkwitz throughout his tenure at Missouri, another guy who has garnered praise. So those are the two that stand out to me in that conversation. I think as time goes on and we have a better feel of who Penn State is truly zoning in on when it's all said and done, that's a conversation we could dive into even deeper, because you've got to not just examine the high school aspect of it, but the transfer portal aspect of it as well. A guy like Drinkwitz might be more equipped to handle the portal in year one just because he has done it for several portal cycles now. And then Hartline is a guy who, sure, he probably could be able to manage the portal window quite well because, again, Ohio State, they do it. Just because he's not the head coach, it's not a foreign concept to him. But he also generate, I think, his more than his fair share of buzz in high school recruiting circles.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be probably the most important transfer portal period that Penn State has faced maybe during this portal era, because of what they're going to need to reset the roster in some significant ways, with the new coaching staff taking a closer look at this thing. And we'll get to that conversation a bit down the road, but certainly something to keep in mind as you sort through the recruiting class. It's a two-pronged approach right now in building a program, and you cannot ignore what the transfer portal can provide you, what it can do for you immediately, not just getting guys that you can develop, but getting guys you can plug and play. We'll see what happens there. Tyler, we appreciate it. We know that you'll be giving up the greatest coverage over at lions247.com, whether it's the transfer portal eventually and currently through the recruiting. This too shall pass, my friend. There will be better articles to write and better stories to dive into with the recruiting conversation on the site and on the podcast. But thanks for weathering the storm with us. Thanks for hopping on the podcast, giving us the latest, and we'll talk to you real soon.
I appreciate you having me back, and I appreciate everyone who stayed reading, man. I know it's not easy to read a lot of my content right now, but we're going to keep chipping away at it and doing what we got to do on our end. And like you just said, man, there will be good pieces coming soon. I can promise you that.
Thanks to Tyler. Appreciate you. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, man.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast. We'll get on the practice field in a matter of hours. And when we come off the practice field, we'll have you set with content over at lions247.com. Notebooks on offense, defense, feedback from Terry Smith, other players that we've heard from since over the course of the week. We'll have some updates there as well. Additionally, we'll get into photo gallery, practice video, a lot coming your way between now and our next episode, which will drop later on Thursday. We'll have a chance to hear from Mark and Daniel, get their thoughts as Penn State prepares for kickoff in Columbus. Big thanks to Tyler Calvaruso. Before him, Patrick Murphy, our Buckeyes insider. Moving forward, we'll talk a lot about this matchup later in the week. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll catch up with you real soon. I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.